So now it's my pleasure to invite the two winemakers. I'm blanking on the name. Shoot. So sorry guys, I have a very poor memory. I just yes, please let's go there. And so the idea of the panel is to see to which extent we can connect this data-driven analysis with boots on the ground kind of feedback from the winemaker. And to me, this is really the moment where we see the value or the lack of value of such analysis by connecting the dots between what has been discussed and the real-life experience of the two winemakers who came and that I'm going to let introduce by themselves. So, John, maybe you can...
No, you can say that. Sorry, I just have one microphone to use.
Hi, guys. I'm John Hamel. I work with my family's vineyard in Sonoma Valley, Hamel Family Wines. Been working there for the past 10 years, so I have a very, I guess, deep knowledge of that area. I know there's people from the Russian River Valley and other parts of Sonoma that probably have a little bit of a different experience from the 2019 vintage, but that's who I am.
Cool. And I'm Gio Ballestreri, winemaker and co-owner of Russian River Vineyards just down the road from here and do a lot of farming right in the Russian River Valley. Actually, about 95% is all done here.
So I hope this is the only time I take the mic because the idea is really to have an active dialogue between the panel and yourselves. But just to get things started, I'd like to ask to which extent your experience of this vintage has borne the footprint of those May rain and the slowdown of leaf area development.
Yes, it was pretty amazing listening to the kind of the science behind the growing season and how it correlated to what the end product was. For me, farming everything in Russian River, it was so slow. I actually told the winery that we're probably going to harvest in November because everything was just so slow. There was a lot of reserves from all the rain, so we got a lot of growth right early in the spring, and then that wet weather, April, May-ish, during bloom, washed a lot of that pollen off and really set things back and delayed kind of ripening. I didn't see veraison. I took some notes. I have a vineyard off Cherry Ridge Road, which is about 5 minutes from here. It was at 30% veraison on 726. Another vineyard on Olivet was at 25% veraison on 8.6. So from previous years, that's about 21 days behind. Then in the flip side on that, I harvested those same two vineyards, the Bella Luna on September 20th and Horse Ridge on September 16th of 19. And in 18, it was September 17th and September 25th. So, I mean, it really, the last year's vintage sped up really quick in that last kind of month after August 15th to about September 15th and caught up. So, again, just listening to what I heard and how it translated to last year's vintage was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I think so. For context, we're probably in what Thibaut was describing as kind of the weaker sites. We're mostly volcanic soils. I would say generally lower vigor. We also farm about 70% of our vineyards without irrigating, so we're in a kind of a unique setting, probably a little bit different than what Giovanni experienced. That being said, I mean, for us, I mean, February, March, and May were all, the temperature max was below normal for our sites. With May, we got about 4 inches of rain. We had no stress going into June, aside from there's a little bit of a heat spike at the beginning of June that we saw a little bit of low humidity and some higher winds and heat. But yeah, I mean, we essentially had better canopy growth than we normally experience. A longer veraison than normal for us, which seeing that kind of in picking decisions, I think what we saw was maybe less pure, like homogeneous ripening, and some more scattered makes the picking decision a little bit harder. But we had a longer veraison that I think impacted a little bit of the vintage from our standpoint. But yeah, I think the May rain, the cooler temperatures. We also, it wasn't really noted here, but August for us, or I guess it was, but maybe more in September in the average. But for us, August was our max temperature average was about 5 degrees above normal. I think that's kind of correlated with the repeated VPD, high VPD events that Thibaut was talking about. And then September, we had a heat spike about the middle of September, and then again around the 24th. And then pretty much after the 24th, the 2-week period afterwards, we finished picking. So.
Joe, maybe a word on the VPD? The heat waves, how does that affect your wine?
I kind of touched on it in the ones in late August. That's where everything was kind of on autopilot, just cruising slowly. And then when we hit these heat spikes, I mean, I'll sample once to twice a week, and they were hovering around 20 bricks around that time. And next thing you know, they're at 23, and it's time to get a little bit serious, and you're starting to watch where flavors are going. I don't really look at pH and TAs when I'm sampling. It's more all about flavor, and I tend to pick riper as opposed to less ripe fruit. So it's really tasting, and I was finding myself tasting a lot more frequent because these heat spikes really sped up that process to a point where I even had one vineyard that was a little over dehydrated, and it wasn't the sugars were rising because of the growing season. It was really because of dehydration in the fruit. And again, I like about 25% in my fruit, but you get more than that. That's when you get those pruny flavors that aren't so desirable, or you end up adding some water.
And would you agree that it's a year that has boosted contrast between different sites, the high vigor versus weak vigor sites, or was that it not relevant? Oh, John, if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a couple sites that are, or specific areas in the vineyard that are higher vigor, and I think the contrast is pretty big. We had, I mean, you guys basically demonstrated it, but we had lower bricks and slower bricks accumulation, color accumulation in those blocks. Other areas did really well that are kind of on the lower vigor end. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our personal, or our experience in our vineyards mirrors, I think, a lot of what was presented.
Joe?
On our vigor sites, there again early on with all the water, we had just huge vigor, and what it again goes back to what I saw was we had so much leaf growth and just canopy management that it took away from the fruit, and there were less yields from that as well. And I didn't really understand that until I saw this, that there's a really big correlation to all of it.
So now that we understand that, how would you farm differently if a same 2019 was around the corner? Like, what would you incorporate from what has been discussed to farm even better?
Well, just early canopy management. It sounds like one of the key factors there.
Yeah, I mean, I think really understanding the impact of May. I think the canopy manipulation that you talked about, I mean, it's an interesting question when, if to hedge in a season like this, and I think you demonstrated, allowing potentially more kind of vertical growth, delaying kind of the manipulation has a good impact. But if you have kind of a site with a lot of canopy at the end of the season, when you have a dry period with repeated VPD events, you could get into trouble with some collapse. So yeah, I think honestly, I think the canopy manipulation was the biggest thing, and probably with the May rain, thinking about cover crop, how long to leave it into the season to help kind of pull water out of the soil. Knowing about that, we might have done things a little bit differently. Yeah.
And maybe before I hand the mics to the attendees, in terms of the perception of the tannins and in terms of the potential for color, what is your take on 2019?
2019. Actually, I just tasted through my 2019s and 18 Pinots, and color-wise, I get a long extraction. Like I'll do a 7 to 10 day cold soak on my wine, so I have never really had an issue with too much color extraction. What I did find though was the texture and the kind of flavor profiles between the 18 and 19 vintages, where there was a lot more aroma characteristics in 19 and a lot more textural characteristics in 18, which was pretty neat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie. I don't think that the seasonal profile was ideal from our standpoint in terms of the kind of wines that we're looking to make. That being said, I mean, I think there was a lot of the plants had a tough time transitioning from vegetative growth to the reproductive growth, and I think you kind of showed there wasn't that stress period. And I think with vines, in lower vigor sites, it could have actually benefited them, and I think we see that in some of our wines. I don't think the year by any means is a high tannin year. I think there's, in general, like what we've noticed is a little bit more freshness to the wines, but I think with the picking, maybe a longer veraison period, we have something that's fresher, but maybe not as deep and complex as 2018, where we were able to have a very slow, without high VPD events, maturation ripening process, and be able to pick without any pressure, kind of at peak ripeness for us. So I think I don't think we made bad wines in 2019, but by no means it was a difficult season. Very tricky in the vineyard, and unfortunately, you're not rewarded for that necessarily with the best fruit.
So thank you for speaking openly. Now I would like to extend questions to you guys, or if you had some of your own feedback that you think confirms or goes against what has been said. It's a nice moment to share that. So are there any questions amongst you?
I was curious, this year I felt like there was a very high incidence of powdery mildew, so I wanted to hear both of your experiences with that and some of the techniques that you use to try to manage that, and if you've seen any sort of effect on your wine's protein stabilities and any sort of increased off aromas from this higher pressure here.
Yeah, I was talking to James earlier kind of about that. We have one site that's on the top of Cherry Ridge Road that's a pretty good vigor site, and we threw a few more canes out there, which gave us more clusters, gave us more leaves, and I was a little bit late on a spray, and the mildew took off, and there was really no controlling it from there once it really set in. So I think it has, with the water reserves that were in the ground and that quick takeoff, when the bud break happened and the cane started to grow, there wasn't no catching up, and it was really a complete loss. I had a home winemaker friend who went and picked some of the fruit that was in there. So there was a lot of pressure. Just learning from that, all the other vineyards, I farm about 9 other vineyards myself. We took it seriously, and our spray program was about 7 to 8 days. It's all organic farming that I do. So we had to stay on that program a lot more strategically and on it, as opposed to 18, where it was, I'm not going to say relaxed, but a lot less pressure then.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, we farm biodynamically, but in terms of spraying, I mean, it's organic, so super tight intervals was important, and having to spray a lot. Another thing that we do that's kind of in line with the biodynamic philosophy is we generally, if we don't have to, we do not hedge. And I think we typically will braid the shoots at the top once they get a certain height above the top wire. And I think the benefit of that in the season is generally if you hedge at the wrong time, you're just going to encourage lateral growth and restricted airflow, yada, yada, yada. So I think that particularly played well for us. We were able to expel a lot of the energy out of the plant vertically versus having it all come just, and having a cost to do more work and have a higher disease pressure. So for us, we didn't have extreme powdery mildew instances, but those were maybe the techniques that worked for us. But unfortunately, it's just you have to spray more, and there's no two ways around it when you're farming with organically.
So wait.
Just given the quality parameters that you're looking at for the wines from 2019, especially compared to 2018, will you do anything different with the wines? So will you potentially, I mean, as Lauren was talking about protein stabilities, will you fine filter? Will you bottle earlier? Have you done something different with oak? Anything like that with the wines?
Yeah, so far for me, no. From 18 to 19, I did notice a lot lower TAs in 19. They were lower than 18. There's a vineyard that I farm that another winemaker gets the one half, and I get the other half. He picked about 7 to 8 days sooner than me, and I sampled when he picked, and it really goes back to winemaking, what your style is. His flavors were a lot less ripe. The acid was a little bit brighter, but they weren't those rich, deeper, kind of blue and darker berry fruits in the Pinot that I like. That really happened 7 days later, so we got a lot more heat in that time. So really, then on the winemaking side, it's kind of just perception and what you like to do. Working with this same vineyard I'm talking about on Cherry Ridge, I've had it since 2014, and it stayed consistently kind of doing the same thing for the last 5 years. So there's really nothing that I have had to do differently.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we're at the kind of a nascent point of understanding the wines and kind of what we'll do. But I think what we've done so far, I mean, is just without the amount of higher tannin, like a 2018 or something. We've used a little bit less new oak, but outside of that, it'll just be kind of evaluating the wine as it ages and seeing what to do. Yeah. Don't have the answer yet.
Yeah.
We kind of just touched on this, but we saw a trend of a little bit lower acids and higher pHs this year. I was wondering if you guys agreed and what your thoughts are on what could be driving that, causing that.
I saw it. The cause was, I think has to do with how the ripening of the season. I mean, it took a lot longer to ripen. Usually the longer that the fruit hangs, that's when your acid starts to diminish. The pH is really still held pretty strong, about 3.5 to 3.6 really, but the acid dropped significantly. If you want to speak to
yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer. It will be interesting to have the feedback from people who are specialized in analytics. But from looking at the degradation curve of malic acids versus tartric, it seems that lower acids is more due to tartric. And to the best of my knowledge, we poorly understand how tartric acid accumulates in the berry. What I speculate is that it has something to do with the ratio between leaves and fruit. A ratio skewed towards more leaves may induce a lower pool of tartric acid per fruit. That's my first speculation. The second one is to which extent heat waves disrupting photosynthetic activity is also contributed to reducing the amount of acid metabolism. But I purely speculate here. But that's what I have in mind, and I welcome anybody who may have some hypothesis.
that does fall in line because our malics were pretty normal, but the tartarics were down.
Yeah, I've nothing really to add. I usually blame our high pH on potassium issues in the vineyard, so I didn't really notice anything like a lower acidity year generally, yeah.
in relation to the higher pHs, we've seen quite an increase in calcium and potassium with a lot of our clients, especially with calcium tartrate instabilities. I'd be curious if you guys have seen that with your own vineyards that you're working with, and then also what climatic factors would attribute to higher calcium levels, particularly with a lot of the flooding that happened in Russian River Valley, if that increased calcium uptake within the vines, and what other, beyond, there's a lot of factors, of course, that would contribute to calcium and potassium, cultural and climatic factors, but what might stand out with your experience, Thibaut and Cecilia, for accumulation of calcium?
Just a quick note, we have noticed increased calcium levels as well over the past several years. Our potassium issues, I'd love it if someone in the room has an answer to that question, because we do note some higher potassium. One thing we did that was fairly interesting this year, we've seen deficiencies early in the season around bloom, and then when we get the must analysis, higher potassium. And Thibaut suggested this, but basically, instead of doing a petiole analysis at bloom or whatever the programmatic thing is, doing it when you have peak nitrogen in the plant, which sometimes is at that time, other times it's not. So we were able to track kind of nitrogen levels, and we did our petiole analyses then, much more reflective of the end result from a potassium standpoint in the juice must. But yeah, I think what we've figured out is there are certain clones and rootstocks and combinations that are have a proclivity for higher potassium, and there's also the soil, the calcium, potassium, magnesium relationship in the soil here is I think can, with certain rootstocks, create higher potassium.
It's difficult. I have no better hypothesis. It's when you look at the literature, we start barely to understand the cycle of nutrients in terms of nitrogen. Studies on potassium, magnesium, and calcium are very rare. I know 3 studies on nitrogen kinetics. I know 1 study on magnesium. On calcium, my best bet would be to look at the ratio of cell wall thickness and the number of cell walls per berry, trying to relate the fact that most of the calcium is in the cell walls. What conditions of the seasons brings more cells, meaning maybe more cell walls, meaning maybe more calcium. We see the context of 2018 means probably more cells. But is the berry cell thickness compensated by the greater number of berry cells? I don't know. I suppose, but I lack backup. And it's a complex molecular chemistry questions. And I know some people doing their thesis on that right now, and it's very fuzzy. So, okay. Is there any further questions? Well, to stay on time, I will let Mark gather a little bit the next steps. Thank you guys for coming and playing the game.